Hey guys, I'm back. After far too long, I am finally putting out another video. The reason for the huge time lapse between this video and my last video was a conflict between the purpose of this channel and the accomplishment of the task that prompted the creation of this channel. Put another way, I realized that I needed to prioritize reading the books from my comps lists over making videos about them. However, I have long felt the urge to put out a new video, and now that I'm reading my second list, making videos about the first list is a good idea for review. So today I am going to review a book called The Canadian Protestant Experience, 1760 to 1990, edited by George Rawlyk. This volume includes 5 essays, each by a different scholar of Christianity in Canada, and covers the time period mentioned in the title of the book, a period covering 230 years. I will summarize each essay's thesis as well as some strengths and weaknesses. Because of how long this will take, I'm dividing the review into 2 videos. So in this video, I'll cover the first 2 essays, and in the second video, I'll cover the last 3 essays. So I'm going to jump right in to the first essay, which is written by a scholar named Nancy Christie, and is called, "In These Times of Democratic Rage and Delusion, Popular Religion and the Challenge to the Established Order, 1760 to 1815. In this article, Nancy Christie presents a well-thought-out essay in which she argues that evangelicalism promoted egalitarian values and ideals of liberty by redefining the individual as a private being, having the right of conscience before God. In reconceiving of the relationship between God and humankind as one in which God communicates through the heart, through emotions, the authoritarian social codes of hierarchical elite culture were challenged and undermined. The social norms represented by the state church valued hierarchy, social rank, and public order. The communal values of this society were challenged by the individual self-expression fostered by evangelicalism. She contends that evangelicalism, which expanded rapidly in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, largely through American influence, challenged the social norms represented by the technically established Church of England in British North America. Evangelicalism became deeply integrated into popular culture. Prominent members of the establishment, such as John Strawn and Charles Inglis, who were both Anglican bishops, accused evangelicals of republicanism. The War of 1812, however, curtailed the rapid expansion and acted as a catalyst for a revival of conservatism. Evangelicalism's expansion dropped off drastically as relations with the new American Republic turned sour and war was declared. She contends, though, that the apparently democratic values fostered by evangelicalism had become so deeply rooted that they formed the underlying basis of later political parties, as well as the source of clashes between church and state in colonial Canada. So one of the first things Christie does in this essay is to highlight her opinion that religious dissent, in the context of an established, state-ordained church, is political dissent, meaning that dissenters would be seen as a threat to the established order. One of the key ideas of evangelicalism was religious liberty, which she and the other historians agree enjoins civil liberty. Thus, she sees an intersection of political and religious ideologies as being a key theme in 18th and 19th century history. This is my first disagreement with her, and my disagreement is not directed towards the facts she represented, but rather her suggestion of an intersection between religious and political ideologies. I find this suggestion problematic for several reasons. First, the relationship between church and culture, or society at large, in the 18th century was far closer than when she wrote this essay. But, you might say, didn't the Enlightenment break the influence of the church over society during the 18th and 19th centuries? The answer? Sort of. While the ideas that came out of the Enlightenment certainly challenged the church in its capacity as an arm of the state was still conceptualized in most countries as being divinely ordained, and it was taken for granted that a nation was a Christian nation, though it would not have necessarily been expressed in this language. So, the idea of there being an intersection between religious and political ideology claims that these categories were somehow discrete. But, you might say, there still would have been political discourse that differed from religious discourse. Yes, that is true, but the radical revolutionary ideas that produced the French Revolution and the republican ideals that sparked the American Revolution which championed the idea of a secular state, did not gain much ground in Britain. Furthermore, political discourse in Britain and British colonial states was predicated on the presupposition of Christendom, and so political discourse was inextricably bound up with religious ideas. The other side of this coin is that the church and religious discourse had implications beyond the church building. In light of these, I think that Christie's suggestion of an intersection between religious and political ideologies is a false dichotomy rooted in her reading of her own context of a secular state into the history. Another criticism I have of Christie's argument is her implication that ideas of democracy, equality, egalitarian values, and civil and religious liberty are rooted solely in the evangelicalism she is describing. She seems to forget entirely the fact that these ideas were also put forward by the philosophes of the French Enlightenment, which culminated in the French Revolution. She also forgets that the seeds of democracy were also to be found in British legal structures and common law. At this point, Britain was a constitutional democracy, its parliament having asserted itself quite unforgettably with the execution of Charles I in 1649, and its victory in a civil war. That being said, I will allow for a degree of overlap between the ideas fostered by evangelicalism and democratic or republican ideas. Clearly, individual self-expression and the belief that God communicates through emotions lays the groundwork for the ideas of religious liberty, a belief which actually already existed, especially amongst the folks like Puritans and Anabaptists, which itself suggests civil liberty. Yet another criticism I have is Christie's characterization of the development of evangelicalism in Canada, from the radical teachings of Henry Alline to the socially respectable evangelicals who essentially ruled Canadian culture in the late 19th century, as a continuum. Conceiving of historical events as a continuum is problematic at the best of times, but in this case it is made worse by the fact that she acknowledges a. the revolutionary nature of evangelicalism's ideas, which constituted a pretty clean break with the past and a definite challenge to the status quo, and b. her admission that the War of 1812 curtailed the expansion of this particular expression of evangelicalism in colonial Canada. A continuum is defined as a sequence in which adjacent elements are not perceptibly different, but the extremes are distinct. In another part of this essay, she claims that the continuities and incremental change that were partially brought about by the expansion of evangelicalism has been downplayed by historians. So, characterizing history with such a technical term as continuum is unhelpful. It's possible that continuity might provide a better description, but I'm skeptical of her description here anyways. Overall, Christie makes an important argument, one with which I am in qualified agreement. Unfortunately, her essay is dense and cluttered with jargon, so while I recommend that it be read for a graduate student studying church history or even an advanced undergraduate, I certainly don't recommend it for those unaccustomed to academic writing. The second essay is written by Michael Gavreau, who, incidentally, is Nancy Christie's husband. This essay is called Protestantism Transformed, Personal Piety and the Evangelical Social Vision, 1815 to 1867. In this essay, Michael Gavreau argues that evangelicalism's model of the relationship between the individual and God, and the corollary notions of individual responsibility and freedom of thought, undermined the Toryist and establishmentarian ideal of an alliance between church and state in British North America. This eventually resulted in an evangelical culture in Canada by the time of Confederation. To support this thesis, Gavreau looks closely at the interactions between evangelical thought and the intellectual trends of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The chief example of this was the founding of church colleges in British North America. The educational approach taken at these transformed the liberal education approach of earlier times, doing away with the classics and replacing it with things more practical for their context. The central issue for evangelical thought was defining the proper relationship between revelation, the Bible, and human intellect. Now, Gavreau argues that for evangelicals, Scripture was at the center of their thought, as a source of doctrine and belief, but also as a record of history. Therefore, theology and history were inextricably linked. They would often appeal to Baconianism because of its ideas of inductive reasoning and empiricism were not only opposed to rationalism but also amenable to the evangelical ethos. The evangelical view of time, Gavreau contends, was instrumental in the cultural shift that took place in British North America, because they saw their present circumstances as a time in a much longer line of Christian history in which great events and heroic acts figured largely. Although Gavreau does not use this term, I would label this as a presupposition of Christendom, as suggested by John Webster Grant, which I've discussed in a previous video. For evangelicals, God was active in history and evident in national and individual history. Through this thinking, the evangelical view of social improvement and moral reform, which had post-millennial overtones, was confidently linked to the larger struggle of Christian history, namely, the expansion and perseverance of the kingdom of God. Gavreau notes that this was especially associated with the Anglo-Saxon peoples and notions of racial superiority. Gavreau claims that the old Tory/establishmentarian belief in the need for some fundamental spiritual principle to undergird a stable society also changed during this time. The 18th century Tory opinion was that the alliance between church and state provided this basis for a stable and ordered society. Evangelicalism, however, in this particular instance, best exemplified by Methodist Egerton Ryerson's writings, posited that the underlying principle of the British Constitution was in fact liberty of conscience and freedom of thought. The latter view came to replace the Tory perspective in the decades leading up to Confederation, largely due to the religiously plural context of British North America and Anglicans' relatively small presence among the population. Now, Gavreau himself claims that the question of the relationship between church and state in British North America was one of the primary subjects of colonial discourse between 1815 and 1840. Now, this came up in three separate but interrelated questions, which I've covered in previous videos, but I will briefly mention. These included the controversies surrounding the clergy reserves, the question about should the state be responsible for running a system of common schools or should they be controlled by denominations, and the question of whether denominational colleges should merge into one secular university or should they be supported by public funds but continue to exist as a loose network of church colleges. Thus, the relationship between church and state was one of critical importance during this time. The manner in which these issues were resolved indicates the growing acceptance of the evangelical principle over against the Tory/Anglican alliance of church and state. Gavreau provides an extremely detailed and well thought out argument in which he assigns primacy to evangelicalism as the main source of cultural values that came to predominate in British North America leading up to and following Confederation. Gavreau focuses on the particular role of the church colleges as the place where evangelical thought, especially regarding their view of history, was articulated and disseminated. Now, while I'll admit that these colleges were instrumental in training up church leaders, who in turn would form the thought of their respective flocks, I think Gavreau neglects the fact that large segments of the population of British North America were largely uneducated. Although it would seem that this reinforces his point, since it means the clergy had even greater influence in spreading this evangelical worldview. It seems to me that religious periodicals would have played a secondary role in the spread of these ideas, although these weren't as common until a little bit later in the period that Gavreau is studying. Gavreau's argument is predicated on a certain definition of evangelicalism as being not so much a fixed philosophical system, but a looser, pervasive body of beliefs. This latter he intends to include in the term creed, and he goes on to use the label evangelical creed. I think this term helps account for such things as revivalism and the largely organic processes by which evangelicalism spread initially, but over the course of the period under Gavreau's study, in this essay at least, it seems that evangelical beliefs actually began to solidify somewhat. His discussion of the intellectual currents and evangelical views of history suggests that there was in fact an underlying philosophical system. It was just very new, and so maybe could not be classified as a philosophical system, even if it did in fact function as one. To reiterate this thesis, Gavreau contends that the voluntary social model put forward by evangelicalism was the primary catalyst in British North America's shift from an 18th century culture to the Victorian mental climate. The essay is exceedingly well argued and makes an important point for students of church history about the influence of religious beliefs on cultures and the deep interrelated nature of church and culture in colonial Canada. I recommend it for anyone interested in the history of Canadian evangelicalism. So thanks for watching this video, guys, and stay tuned for part 2, which I'll be posting soon.